What's something your parents believe that you don't?
Are you ready for a shocking truth? The night my sister stole my engagement celebration with her announcement, I said nothing, but that silence was not weakness, it was calculation, and it became the beginning of a plan that none of them saw coming. You need to understand the setting to make sense of how sharp the sting was. Daniel and I had worked for months to put together a simple, joyful evening, not a showy one, just something where family and close friends could gather, raise a glass, and feel like they were part of something meaningful in our lives. We wanted laughter, we wanted warmth, and we wanted the focus on what we had just promised each other. It was going exactly as I hoped until Brooke, my sister, decided the room belonged to her. She waited until the toast was halfway done, until all eyes were naturally on us, and then she stood up and dropped it like she had rehearsed it in her head for weeks. "Sorry, but I am pregnant, so the attention's on me now." That was her exact wording. People clapped. Some even laughed, like it was some kind of comedy routine. My parents smiled so wide I thought their cheeks would split. And, just like that, every conversation shifted. Guests circled her like she was the star of the night, while Daniel and I were left finishing a toast no one was even listening to anymore. I sat there frozen, not because I had nothing to say, but because I had too much. I wanted to shout. I wanted to tell everyone that this wasn't new, that she had a pattern of hijacking moments. At my high school graduation, she showed up in tears about breaking up with her boyfriend, and suddenly my diploma was background noise. At my birthday dinner 2 years ago, she accidentally FaceTimed everyone to show off her new apartment right in the middle of cake cutting. Even when I got promoted at work and my parents invited family over to celebrate, she conveniently announced a vacation package she and Ryan booked, complete with photos on her phone passed around the table. This was not an isolated slip, this was a career in stealing attention. But I did not speak. I squeezed Daniel's hand under the table, and he looked at me like he already knew what was boiling in my head. He leaned closer and whispered, "How do you want to handle this?" That was the first moment I realized I was not going to play the old game. In the past, I had whined to my mom, I had begged for fairness, I had tried to shrug it off while stewing inside. None of it worked. Brooke was used to me going quiet, letting the anger dissolve behind closed doors. She expected I would sulk, and she would keep the spotlight. Instead, I chose something else. I chose silence as strategy, not surrender. I stayed calm that entire night. I clapped when others clapped. I nodded when people said, "What a special evening for the whole family." I even hugged her when she left, and I watched her smirk because she thought she had pulled it off again. Daniel and I drove home in silence, and then he asked the question that unlocked everything. "What kind of consequences do you want?" Not "do you want to let this go," but "what do you want to do about it?" That wording gave me permission to think bigger. We sat on our couch, and I listed every hijacked moment. I spoke them out loud like they were exhibits in a trial. Graduation. Birthday. Promotion. Now engagement. He nodded after each one, like he was the jury already convinced. And then I said something I had never said before. She does it because we let her. If no one stops clapping, she keeps going. I wanted to stop. The plan formed faster than I thought. We had just approved the design for our save-the-date cards, but they were not printed yet. I called the printer the next morning and asked if it was too late to make one adjustment. It was not. I told them to add a single line at the bottom, nothing flashy, nothing rude, just one sentence. "Please, no surprise announcements or toasts unrelated to the couple. Help us keep this day about what it is." Then I added a QR code that led to a simple page Daniel and I had written that week, telling our story in our own words, how we met, how he proposed, why this day mattered. We wanted people to remember that there was a bigger picture here than a one-liner in a restaurant. When I hit approve on the design and the printer promised a rush delivery, I felt something click in my chest. For the first time in years, I was not waiting for Brooke to choose whether or not she would ruin something. I was building a wall around my day and daring her to climb it. Daniel kissed the top of my head and said, "Now we see how they respond." The night of the party had ended with me looking like I had lost again, but the truth is that was only Act 1. The morning after, mailboxes started filling with those cards, and my phone began to buzz with reactions. Some were surprised, some were supportive, and one number in particular was sure to light up soon. I waited, because I knew Brooke would not let a single line of text go unanswered. And I was right. By the time the first save-the-date cards landed in mailboxes, I had already coached myself to stop bracing for the usual blowback and start listening for the quiet majority who actually appreciate when someone draws a clear line. And sure enough, the first messages that came in were from cousins I barely hear from who said the card felt like relief because they were tired of every family event mutating into a stage for whoever was loudest. Then a neighbor who has watched us grow up texted that the little note at the bottom was the first honest thing she had seen on a wedding invite in years, and even my aunt, the one who keeps a running scoreboard of every social slight like it is a hobby, called to say she was proud that we asked for what we needed without being rude, which told me the tone was landing exactly where I aimed it, firm but not theatrical, specific but not cruel. I was halfway through answering those messages when Brooke's name lit up my screen, and I picked up because avoiding her would have turned a simple boundary into an invitation for escalation. And she did not waste a second before unloading the speech she had clearly rehearsed, accusing me of policing pregnant women, of making her feel unsafe, of turning our wedding into a courtroom where she would be judged for existing. And I let her finish every sentence because I have learned that cutting her off only feeds her story that I never listen. Then I said in one careful breath that the line on the card was not about her or any particular life event. It was about our day staying our day. And that I was done pretending that surprise announcements during other people's milestones were somehow adorable when they actually bulldozed the point of the gathering. She tried a different angle, one she knows has worked on me before, which is to ask whether I really want to be the kind of sister who keeps joy small. And I answered that I want to be the kind of sister who celebrates at the right time and place so everyone gets to feel big when it is their moment, and that if she wanted help planning something to honor her news, I would gladly show up with flowers and cake, but that our wedding and all the events tied to it were not a free microphone for anything unrelated, and I could hear the silence on her end as she realized I was not moving an inch. Within the hour, my parents called, and because they are conflict avoidant in a way that feels baked into their bones, they opened with soft concern about tone, asked if the note could be reprinted without the line because people know how to behave. And I said with no heat that people know how to behave when rules are clear, and that we had already seen what happens when the rules are implied, which is that Brooke improvises a headline and everyone claps to keep the peace, and that I was not paying for a day that depended on the kindness of a person who consistently treats other people's milestones as stepping stones for her own applause. Daniel, who has always been my calmest mirror, put our approach into a simple process that even I needed to hear out loud, and together we wrote an update on the wedding page linked by the QR code that clarified how to help, which was to keep toasts focused on us, to share unrelated news in private after the event, and to reach out directly if anyone felt unsure about whether something belonged in the program. And then he called the venue to designate a single person in charge of the microphone, with authority to end any off-script speech, which stripped away the technical leverage that attention seekers rely on when they decide to test a boundary and count on the crowd to carry them. The responses continued to roll in, and they were not uniform, because families never are, but there was a pattern I could feel underneath the surface chatter. A quiet alignment from people who have watched me swallow my frustration for years and were finally seeing me keep my voice steady without raising it, and it helped that I refused to make it personal even when Brooke did. Because each time she framed herself as the target, I gently pulled the frame back to a neutral rule, which is the only kind of rule that lasts. Late that afternoon, Brooke texted a paragraph about how she might skip the wedding if she was going to be muzzled, and I answered with a message I drafted slowly, telling her I would be sad if she skipped, but that I would not alter the boundary, and that there would be other gatherings where she could be the center without stealing it, and for the first time I added one new sentence that changed the temperature of the conversation, which was that the venue staff would follow a written policy, and that no amount of pressure on me, Daniel, or our parents would change that, because this was no longer about personal pleading, it was about logistics. That evening, while we were making dinner, I looked at Daniel and said I felt strangely calm, which surprised me because I expected to be tense after that phone call. And he said that calm is what happens when you move from hoping people behave to designing for when they do not. And I realized that was the real shift. Not the sentence on the card, not the webpage, not the microphone plan. But the fact that I had stopped begging for cooperation and started building consequences that did not require a fight, and that feeling settled into my chest like something I had been missing since we were teenagers. I went to bed thinking the worst pushback would be emotional and loud, which is Brooke's preferred terrain, but the next morning a very different kind of alert lit up my phone, and it was not a text and not a voicemail from family. It was the venue asking me to confirm a change that I had never requested, and that is when I understood that this would not just be about words and tone and social pressure, because someone had already tried to move the ground under my feet, and I was about to find out how far they were willing to go. When the venue manager's number appeared on my phone that morning, I assumed it would be a routine confirmation about catering counts or table layouts, but instead I was greeted by a polite yet uneasy voice asking me to confirm the changes I had just requested, which stopped me cold because I had not requested a single alteration since locking everything down the week before. The manager explained that a caller identifying herself as the bride had phoned earlier, asking to downgrade the package, reduce the deposit, and even shift the date to a later weekend, all under the claim that family circumstances had changed. My stomach turned as he read back the details, not because I was surprised by the sabotage attempt, but because I knew exactly who would be behind it, and hearing the proof from a neutral party was like watching a pattern step out of the shadows into broad daylight. I asked for the caller ID log, and when the manager read the digits aloud, I recognized Ryan's number immediately. That was Brooke's husband, a man who rarely speaks up in group settings, always looking like he wants to melt into the background, yet here he was lending his phone to an attack on our wedding plans. I requested that the manager put every detail of the attempted change in writing, and within minutes an email arrived with the exact timestamp of the call, the requests made, and the fact that the voice had introduced herself as the bride. I thanked him, promised to send a written confirmation of our true plan, and hung up with my heart pounding, but my focus sharp. This was no longer about sibling rivalry or bruised egos. This was interference that could have cost us thousands of dollars and potentially our entire date. I opened my laptop and began drafting a careful but firm email to my parents, laying out the facts without commentary. I attached the venue manager's note, highlighted Ryan's number, and wrote a single line at the end. This is what happens when boundaries are ignored. Within minutes, my father responded with silence, no defense, no denial, just an ellipsis followed by, "We'll talk." My mother sent a softer message urging me not to escalate, but offering no explanation, which told me everything about where their loyalties were bending under pressure. Meanwhile, my phone buzzed with a short, hesitant text from Ryan that said it was a misunderstanding, that he must have miscommunicated with the venue. As though anyone accidentally asks to reschedule a wedding and downgrade a package under someone else's name. Daniel watched me pace the kitchen and finally said we needed to treat this like a project under siege, and I knew he was right. That night we set up two-factor authentication on every vendor account, switched all communications to a shared inbox, and created a unique passphrase with each vendor so that no change could be accepted unless it was confirmed from our official email and repeated verbally by us. I also purchased event insurance that would cover financial losses in case of sabotage, a step I had never thought necessary before, but the fact that I even considered it now showed how little faith I had left in my sister's ability to restrain herself. The next morning, with Daniel at my side, I sent a final message to the venue manager and every other vendor we had hired. I explained that any future interference or attempted changes from outside parties should be ignored and reported, and that any fees incurred due to false requests would be billed to the interfering party whose information had been recorded. To make the point airtight, I had Ryan sign a short letter acknowledging the attempted call and accepting financial liability for any further interference. He looked ashamed when I presented it to him, but shame is not the same as accountability, and I knew the only way forward was through paperwork and policies that left no room for excuses. By the end of that week, I had turned what started as a personal ambush into a system of checks so tight that no one could touch our wedding without leaving a trail. Strangely enough, that gave me a sense of control I had not felt in years of living under Brooke's shadow, where I used to believe my only options were to either absorb the damage or confront her in a shouting match that made me look bitter. This time I did neither. I built walls so high and rules so clear that she would have to burn her reputation to the ground just to scale them. For a few days, I allowed myself to breathe, thinking maybe the message had landed, that Brooke would back down after realizing her tactics had not only failed, but left evidence pointing straight at her household. But that calm dissolved when I opened the family group chat and saw a stream of selective screenshots, half-truths, and exaggerated claims being shared about how I was punishing a pregnant woman and turning a celebration into a police state. The story had shifted from logistical sabotage to character assassination, and my mother was now playing along by forwarding Brooke's messages and adding sympathetic comments like, "We just want peace." It became clear that this war was not only being fought in contracts and vendor calls, but also in the court of family opinion, where facts rarely matter more than emotion. I stared at the screen, reading accusations that made me look cold and controlling, while the real evidence sat quietly in my email folder. And in that moment, I realized the next stage would not be about defending myself privately, but about forcing the truth into the open in a way no one could deny. And as much as I dreaded the fallout, I knew there was only one way to do it: put everything on the table, in person, where excuses cannot hide behind emojis or dramatic punctuation. So I scheduled a coffee at my parents' house, invited Brooke, and printed every document I had collected into a neat folder that looked more like a legal case than a family disagreement. I told Daniel this was not about revenge anymore, but about refusing to live under constant distortion of the truth. And as I tucked that folder into my bag, I understood that the next move would either end the smear campaign or burn every bridge left between us. But either way, I was finally ready to stop playing defense. Walking into my parents' living room that Sunday afternoon felt less like visiting family and more like preparing to enter a courtroom where the jury had already been primed with a one-sided story. Because by then the family group chat had been saturated with Brooke's edited screenshots and tearful narratives about being targeted, and many relatives had piled on with messages of support for her without even asking me a single clarifying question. I knew if I tried to argue back in that digital arena, my words would be twisted or drowned out by a chorus of people who preferred drama to details, so I had chosen a different strategy, one that felt colder but infinitely more effective. I had printed every piece of evidence, every vendor email, every record of what had actually happened, and I carried them in a folder that I placed carefully on the coffee table. Not as a weapon, but as the kind of undeniable proof that leaves no room for spin. Brooke arrived late, flanked by Ryan, her eyes already flashing with the certainty of someone expecting an ambush, but determined to play the victim no matter what. She sat down with arms crossed, and before she could even begin her speech about how I had ruined her reputation, I slid the folder across the table to my parents and asked them to read. My father, usually quiet to the point of being invisible in conflicts, opened it without hesitation, scanning the vendor's time-stamped notes, Ryan's phone number tied to the sabotage call, and the signed letter of liability that Ryan had reluctantly provided. He did not speak for a long moment, and the silence was louder than anything Brooke could have shouted. My mother, however, tried to fill the space with soft dismissals, saying things like, "It was probably just a misunderstanding, and do we really need to be this formal about family matters?" But her voice cracked when she saw her son-in-law's signature admitting responsibility. Brooke could not contain herself, and she exploded into accusations, insisting that I had orchestrated the entire thing to make her look bad, that I was jealous of her pregnancy, that I wanted to humiliate her publicly. I kept my voice calm, steady, and deliberate, explaining in a single paragraph that this was not about jealousy or punishment, but about a repeated pattern where important moments in my life were derailed, dismissed, or overshadowed by her need to redirect attention. I reminded them of the graduation incident, the birthday interruption, the promotion dinner that became a travel slideshow, and now the engagement that turned into a pregnancy announcement. I told them plainly that this was the line in the sand, and that I was done allowing my milestones to be treated as props in someone else's performance. My father surprised everyone when he finally spoke. He said he had noticed the pattern for years, but had avoided acknowledging it to keep peace in the house, and that avoidance had only made it worse. My mother started to protest, but he cut her off, which he almost never does, and said that protecting peace by ignoring truth is not peace at all. Brooke stormed out at that point, slamming the door so hard that the frame rattled, but for the first time I did not chase after her to apologize or beg for reconciliation. I sat still, letting the weight of her absence settle over the room, and allowed myself to feel the satisfaction of not folding under pressure. That evening I sat with Daniel and made a decision that would reshape the entire tone of our wedding. I called the professional host we had hired for the reception and gave him one simple instruction. No microphone would be handed to anyone unless it was pre-approved by me or Daniel, and if someone attempted to take over the program, he was authorized to cut them off immediately. It was not about creating tension, it was about preventing the exact chaos that had defined too many of our family gatherings. Then I took the hardest step of all. I called Ava, my closest friend since college, and asked her to step in as my maid of honor. I explained that while tradition might dictate that the role belonged to my sister, trust dictated otherwise, and I needed someone who would treat the position with respect instead of as a platform for performance. Ava accepted without hesitation, her voice firm with loyalty, and I felt the kind of relief that comes from finally aligning roles with reality. Later that night, after all the calls and arrangements were complete, I went to bed thinking maybe the worst was over, that Brooke's exit from the meeting signaled her retreat, but around midnight Daniel found an envelope slipped under our door. Inside was a single sonogram photo, and taped to it was a yellow sticky note in Brooke's handwriting that read, "Try and make this not about me." I stared at that photo until my eyes blurred, and I realized she was not retreating at all, she was escalating. It was not enough for her to hijack my engagement party, attempt to sabotage our wedding logistics, or poison the group chat. Now she was daring me to fight her on the one thing she knew people would instinctively defend, her pregnancy. Holding that photo, I felt the sharpest clarity I had experienced in months. This was no longer about wedding logistics or polite boundaries, it was about rewriting the script of our family dynamic entirely. And the next move I made would determine whether Brooke continued to control the narrative or whether I finally cut off the oxygen supply that fed her constant need for attention. The game had changed, and I knew where to aim. I woke up the morning after finding the sonogram under our door with the kind of tired resolve that does not feel like anger anymore because it has matured into a choice. And that choice was to stop trying to out a performance and to start changing the stage rules so completely that the performance could not survive, which is exactly why I opened our wedding website and added a new section called Promises, a small heading with 3 short commitments that sounded simple but carried weight. Like anchors, that we would tell the truth even when it is uncomfortable, that we would celebrate without comparisons because everyone deserves to be big when it is their day. And that we would protect each other's milestones because family does not mean surrendering your moments to whoever speaks the loudest. I wrote it in a calm voice, not to shame anyone but to lay down a frame that could not be spun, and beneath it I added one offer that would either bring peace or expose the bad faith for what it was, a private dinner 2 weeks after the wedding to honor Brooke's pregnancy with our parents and a small circle, fully planned and paid for by me, with a thoughtful gift already wrapped and a promise to help throw a proper shower. On one condition that I knew reasonable people would recognize as fair, that she keep our wedding and the events around it free of surprise announcements and disruption, which meant no sudden toasts, no baiting, no attempts to test the microphone rules, and that if the boundary was ignored I would step back until after the baby arrived and move forward with strong but quiet distance. I published the page, took a breath that felt like I had been holding it since childhood, and told Daniel that this would be the last negotiation, because I was done feeding a problem that starved on structure. The days leading into the ceremony were quieter than I expected, not because everyone agreed with me, but because paperwork and policy did what lectures never do. They replaced arguments with logistics that could be verified. And small confirmations kept arriving like soft checkpoints. The vendor passphrase held. The host rehearsed the timing. The seating chart placed the family near the front, but without a single line of sight to the microphone stand. And the music cues lived on a schedule that could not be hijacked by a cousin waving for attention. When my mother asked for the 100th time whether we really needed such strict flow control, I answered without heat that we needed it because we had spent years pretending people would behave when asked nicely, and when she worried that Brooke would feel excluded. I said she was included exactly as much as she chose to be, which is to say she was welcome to show up, smile, eat, dance, and be loved, as long as she did not turn our day into a runway for her next dramatic entrance, and to my surprise my father nodded and said he finally understood that boundaries are not bans. They are rules that allow everyone to relax because they know what will happen and what will not. On the wedding day, the pieces clicked into place with the sense of inevitability that follows good planning rather than luck. And I walked down the aisle without narrating a single surface detail in my head because this was never about a dress or a backdrop or a sunset. It was about keeping a promise to myself that I would not abandon my own day to keep someone else comfortable. And as the vows were spoken and the room settled into that quiet hum that families have when they are collectively moved, I felt a steadiness that had been missing for years, a feeling that I was not at the mercy of anyone's mood or need for spotlight. During the reception, the host carried the program with a calm authority that took the oxygen out of any impulse to improvise, and while I saw Brooke shift in her chair a few times with that familiar itch to stand and make the moment hers, each time the host smoothly transitioned to the next element with a tone so cheerful and final that no one felt the gap where trouble might have slipped in, and the crowd simply followed along, enjoying themselves without realizing how close they were to the old pattern repeating. Halfway through dinner, I walked to Brooke's table with Daniel at my side and handed her a sealed card, and inside it was not a trap or a scold. It was a reservation confirmation for the pregnancy dinner I had promised and a short note in my handwriting that said, "I want you to have your own headline. Please let me keep mine." And I watched her face as she read those words and realized there was nothing left for her to attack without admitting the truth everyone could feel, that this evening was living proof the family could celebrate one thing at a time without anyone losing, and that the only way to wreck it would be to choose chaos in a room that had been carefully designed to reject it. She put the card back in the envelope and stared at her glass, and for once she did not rise to test the system, because the system would have held and she knew it, and because there is a different kind of mirror in a room that will not clap for bad behavior. We danced, we cut cake, we missed nothing, and not a single moment was stolen. Not because I outperformed my sister, but because I refused to audition for a role I never wanted. The accommodating target who absorbs the hit and smooths the edges so everyone else can stay comfortable. And as the night wound down, I felt the odd relief of having been perfectly ordinary, a bride at her own wedding, nothing more and nothing less. In the days that followed, the reviews from relatives came in like notes from a calmer universe. Comments about how the reception felt focused and relaxed, how the host kept things on track without being controlling, how they loved the little promises section on the site because it gave them a sense of where we were headed as a couple and what we valued, and my mother, who is addicted to the idea that grace means never saying no, admitted in a quiet voice that the rules had made it easier for her to simply enjoy the night, and that maybe she had confused politeness with peace for too long. 2 weeks later, we held the pregnancy dinner exactly as promised, small, warm, and honest, and Brooke arrived without a spotlight and apologized in a way that was not perfect, but was real enough to start stitching a new shape into our family fabric. And I accepted it with conditions that were no longer theories whispered after the fact, but living boundaries written in simple sentences that anyone could understand. I do not pretend that one evening rewrote every instinct forged over years of attention games, and I do not promise that there will not be flare-ups when the baby is born or when another family milestone arrives. But I do know that something fundamental changed because the power balance shifted from whoever was loudest to whoever held the rules, and those rules now belong to me and Daniel when it comes to our life. People sometimes ask whether the price of that win was too high, whether I should have let things slide to keep the holidays smooth, and I tell them that smooth is not the same as good, that quiet is not the same as healthy, and that nothing about growing up says you must keep shrinking so someone else can feel bigger. I did not break my sister. I broke the habit of letting her write my story, and the result was not fireworks or humiliation. It was a clean evening where love did not have to trip over someone's performance to be seen. She took my spotlight once, and I took back the stage by changing where the light could land, and if you have ever lived under a person who mistakes attention for affection, you know exactly why that felt less like revenge and more like finally getting home.